Something unusual, almost unthinkable, is happening inside Iran's government right now. And it didn't start on the streets. It started behind closed doors, quiet rooms, serious faces, people whispering instead of speaking loudly. January 2026.
Well, tonight, protests have erupted in Tehran after Iran's exiled crown prince, Reza Pahlavi, called for a mass demonstration. Now, shortly after he made that call, internet and phone services across the country were cut.
We will not bow down in the face of any of these difficulties. World powers are lining up with cowardice to force us to bow our heads. Just as you did not bow down in the face of difficulties, we will not bow down in the face of these problems.
Inside Tehran, members of the Central Council of the Iranian Reform Front gathered for what was supposed to be a routine meeting, but it quickly turned into something else, something explosive. They drafted a statement, not about economic reforms, not about easing sanctions, not about negotiations with the West. No, they wrote something far more dangerous. They called for the resignation of the country's most powerful leadership and the transfer of power to a transitional council. Let that sink in for a moment. Officials inside the system, calling for the system to step aside. That kind of language isn't reform, that's regime change, from the inside. Now, normally, something like this would shake the entire country the moment it becomes public. But it never reached the public, because security forces found out. And when they did, the response was immediate. Threats. Heavy threats. Not the kind politicians exchange on television. Now, before we talk about the protests, the shootings, and the international reactions, we need to look at the first signs that something inside the government was already breaking, because the first people to signal trouble were not protesters, they were officials. Let's start with the economy. If you want to know whether a government is stable, don't always listen to speeches. Watch the currency. Money tells the truth faster than politicians do, and Iran's currency has been screaming for help. At one point recently, the Iranian rial collapsed to around 1.44 million rials for $1. Think about that. A number so large most people can barely process it. When a currency reaches that point, it's not just inflation, it's panic. It's people trying to escape a sinking boat. And right in the middle of that crisis, something happened. The head of Iran's central bank, Mohammad Reza Farzin, stepped down, resigned. Now governments usually try to make these things sound calm. Leadership change, administrative adjustment. But anyone who has watched politics long enough knows what it often means. Someone doesn't want to be the one standing there when the numbers finally collapse. Farzin left, and Abdel Nasser Hemati was brought in the middle of chaos. That's not routine, that's survival mode. And then another moment raised even more eyebrows. Iran's vice president, Mohammad Reza Aref, reportedly tried to resign. Think about that for a second. The vice president trying to leave. But President Masoud Pezeshkian refused to accept it, which tells us something fascinating. Someone high up wanted out, and someone else insisted they stay. Almost like passengers arguing about whether to abandon a plane that's already losing altitude. Now maybe you're thinking, okay, political tension happens everywhere. True. But this is where the story takes a darker turn, because while these internal struggles were unfolding, something else was happening outside government buildings. The streets were filling with people. It began on December 28, 2025. At first, the protest looked familiar. Economic frustration, people angry about prices, about wages, about the currency collapsing. That's something many countries experience. But then the tone changed, quickly. Within days, the protests weren't just about money anymore. People began chanting for something bigger. The end of the system, not reform, not negotiations, a complete political shift. That's when governments usually face a choice, talk or force. And Iran's leadership chose force. On January 8th, the situation escalated dramatically. Security forces moved in to crush the demonstrations. Reports coming out afterward described a brutal crackdown, mass arrests, gunfire, entire neighborhoods under heavy security presence. What happened during those days shocked even seasoned observers, because the scale of the violence, according to several claims circulating in political circles, was enormous. And when events reach that level, something else starts happening behind the scenes. Now pause here for a second, because this detail matters. Iran already has multiple security institutions: the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Basij Militia, National Police Forces, a large security network. So if a government still brings in outside fighters, observers start asking why. Is it about reinforcement or about trust? Because in many historical cases, governments bring in outside forces when they're not fully confident their own people will follow orders. And that possibility alone tells you how tense things may be inside the country right now. Meanwhile, the situation has started drawing reactions internationally. Leaders around the world are watching closely. Statements are becoming sharper. Speculation is growing. Some officials in Europe are even suggesting the events unfolding could mark a turning point for Iran's political future. But the most dramatic reaction came from the United States. Former President Donald Trump, who returned to office as the 47th President of the United States, issued a warning as reports of the violence spread. He signaled that if the killing continued, the United States could respond. That comment immediately raised the stakes, because once Washington starts making statements like that, the situation stops being only domestic. It becomes geopolitical. Iran, the United States, regional militias, Europe watching closely, and inside Iran, officials quietly arguing about whether the system can hold together. Now here's the key question. Is this just another wave of unrest that will eventually fade? Or are we seeing the early stages of something bigger? Because history shows that governments rarely collapse only because of protests. They collapse when internal fractures begin, and that may already be happening. Now here's the moment that really changed the equation. Not the protests, not the resignations. Fear stopped working. And if you've studied governments that rule through intimidation, you'll know something important. The day fear stops working, the clock starts ticking. For nearly 5 decades, Iran's leadership relied on a very predictable formula. Pressure people, arrest critics, control information, make an example out of anyone who challenges the system. And for a long time, it worked. But something shifted this time. People watched thousands die. And instead of disappearing back into their homes, they kept protesting. That terrified officials inside the system. Because once a population stops being afraid, the government loses its most powerful weapon. And that's when insiders reportedly delivered a blunt message to the country's top leadership. Fear no longer works. Imagine hearing that if you're running a government built on fear. That's not criticism, that's a warning. And it explains why reformist leaders inside Iran took such a risky step. They didn't just complain. They drafted a statement demanding a transfer of power to a transitional council. Not reforms, not negotiations. A transition. That is political language normally used when a system is nearing the end of its life. And security forces understood exactly what it meant, which is why they reacted so aggressively. The United States made one of the most dramatic moves early on. President Donald Trump's warning that America will intervene to protect the Iranian people if violence continues sent shockwaves through diplomatic channels. It was unusually direct, and the presence of U.S. naval forces in the region made the message even harder to ignore. For reformist politicians inside Iran, that kind of pressure changes the political calculus, because if outside powers become involved, the entire situation could spiral into something unpredictable, which may explain why some insiders pushed for leadership change before the crisis grows even larger. Europe followed with its own decisive move. The European Union designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization. That decision carries enormous implications. Financial networks affected, travel restrictions, legal consequences, and perhaps most importantly, international isolation. For Tehran, losing legitimacy abroad while facing unrest at home creates a dangerous combination. And then came another moment analysts are still discussing. President Masoud Pezeshkian apologized to the Iranian people for the crackdown. An apology from a president, while the supreme leader remains silent. That's not just a speech, that's a signal. Some see it as an attempt to calm the public, others see it as something deeper. A political gap beginning to appear inside the leadership. And in systems where power is tightly concentrated, even small cracks can grow quickly. Which brings us back to the central question many observers are asking right now. Is Iran experiencing another protest cycle? Or the early stages of a major political shift? Because history often shows the same pattern. Now step back for a moment. And look at the bigger picture, because what's happening in Iran right now is not just protests, not just politics, not just economics. It's everything hitting at the same time. And that's usually when systems begin to crack. You see, repression can silence people for a while, but repression cannot fix a broken economy. It cannot suddenly create prosperity. And that's something reformist figures inside Iran appear to understand very clearly now. Because look at what just happened. 30,000 people killed in 2 days, according to reports circulating among political insiders. An unimaginable number. A brutal attempt to stop the uprising. But did it fix inflation? No. Did it stabilize the currency? No. Did it restore confidence? Not even close. For years, Tehran relied on a network of allied groups across the Middle East. That network was supposed to extend power far beyond Iran's borders. But in recent conflicts, that strategy has taken serious hits. Militant groups weakened, allies under pressure, political shifts in neighboring countries. Then came the war in June 2025, and that conflict changed the military equation. Air defenses damaged, missile capabilities reduced, key strategic facilities struck. Several major sites connected to Iran's nuclear infrastructure were targeted. Fordow, Natanz, Isfahan, facilities that once symbolized deterrence, suddenly looked vulnerable. Now, whether those calls represent a majority or not is still debated, but the symbolism alone is powerful. 47 years after the revolution that created the Islamic Republic, people openly discussing the system that existed before it. That is something the leadership never wanted to hear again. And it's not just happening inside Iran. Large demonstrations abroad have amplified the message. Rallies organized in major cities, Los Angeles, Toronto, Munich, hundreds of thousands gathering to show solidarity with protesters inside Iran. Images spreading across social media, crowds waving old Iranian flags, calling for political change. And here's the part that matters most for Tehran. Officials inside the country see those images too. They hear those chants. They realize an alternative narrative is gaining momentum. That alone can create anxiety inside a political system. Because once people begin imagining a different future, control becomes harder. Now go back again to that reformist statement, because in this context, it makes more sense. Those leaders weren't just reacting emotionally. They may have been thinking strategically. They saw several warning signs at once. American aircraft carriers positioned nearby, strong statements coming out of Washington, European governments tightening pressure, economic collapse worsening, public anger rising, and a military deterrence that no longer looks as solid as it once did. Put all of that together, and some insiders may have reached a simple conclusion. If leadership doesn't change internally, it could be forced from the outside. So they drafted a document, a proposal, step down, transfer authority to a transitional council, create a pathway out before the crisis becomes irreversible. But the security apparatus reacted quickly. Threats were issued, warnings delivered, and the statement disappeared. Still, ideas like that don't vanish completely once they've been written. They spread quietly, discussed in offices, whispered in corridors, which brings us to another factor tightening the pressure on Iran: sanctions. In September 2025, international measures that had previously been lifted under the nuclear agreement were restored. The so-called snapback sanctions. That meant severe restrictions returning across major sectors: banking, insurance, energy markets, financial transactions. For an economy already struggling, the impact was heavy, companies losing access to global systems, oil exports facing new barriers, investors staying away. Inside Iran, reformists know these conditions make recovery extremely difficult. And that's another reason some believe they wanted leadership change, because under the current circumstances, solutions appear limited. Now, when analysts step back and look at the full picture, several developments stand out. The central bank chief resigned. A vice president attempted to resign. Reformist leaders drafted a statement demanding a transition of power. Protests erupted nationwide. Workers joined the unrest. International pressure intensified. Foreign militias reportedly appeared on Iranian soil, and global leaders began openly discussing the future of the regime. Inside government circles, people are asking questions that were once unthinkable. And once those questions start circulating, the future becomes unpredictable. Here are the two scenarios many analysts are watching closely. If more officials begin resigning, the internal fracture could widen. If that resignation statement ever leaks publicly, it could trigger open political confrontation inside the system. Either the leadership manages to stabilize the situation, or internal pressure and external forces combine to push events in a completely new direction. And right now, nobody can say with certainty which path Iran will take. But one thing is clear: something unusual is happening inside the country's power structure, something that hasn't been seen at this scale in decades. And the world is watching very closely, because the next moves from protesters, from officials, and from foreign governments could shape the future of the region. So now we want to hear from you. What do you think is really happening inside Iran? Is this another protest cycle or the beginning of something much bigger? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep following stories like this, the kind that mainstream headlines sometimes miss, support the channel, like the video, subscribe, and stay with us as this story continues to unfold, because the situation inside Iran is far from over.